exhibit at the Textile Museum in Prato takes a look at the history of vintage fashions and textiles, exploring a recent trend that has placed the fascinating vintage clothing and lifestyle back into the spotlight. The exhibit is called Vintage, the Irresistible Charm of the Past. It's an exhibit that explores various aspects of clothing from 25 or more years ago. From street fashion to haute couture, from Woodstock to the red carpet, the exhibit features more than 120 items of clothing, accessories, and textiles, as well as documents and multimedia displays. Arranged both thematically and chronologically, the show is organized with the Vintage Store and Archive from Florence, Angelo, and in collaboration with a host of international fashion houses like Gucci, Salvatore Ferragamo, Pucci, and Max Mara.
The exhibit intends to tell the story of vintage, of this very contemporary phenomenon that has a very long tradition in the commerce of second-hand or used goods. In the first section, there are some examples of the reuse of objects of clothing, because in fact, material was very costly. So it was never thrown out, but was often given new life through resewing or reuse in either clothing or furniture. So in this section, we are showing some historical items of clothing that show evidence of this constant reworking of the clothes or of the cloth. In the second section, we deal with the theme of reuse of fibers, looking at the example of Prato, which, since the beginning of the 19th century, with the invention of the rag-making machine, permitted a process of making regenerated wool. This involves infinite amounts of old wool clothing, destined for recycling of its fibers. Nowadays, the warehouses of Prato hold not just wool destined for recycling, but they also select pieces that might be of interest for the commerce of used clothing, that is, for vintage sale. In the third section of the exhibit, the largest one, we look at the history of the phenomenon that changes from second-hand to vintage. The story starts essentially in the years of protest, the late 60s and 70s, when the youth of the time, in search of a clothing style that was personal and reflected their ideologies, went to the used clothing markets looking for American jeans, military clothes, folk or ethnic pieces. The diffusion of this phenomenon and its popularity grew in the 1970s and became interesting also to the high-end fashion sector, where at the end of the 1970s they started incorporating folk or casual influences into collections that were of course both casual fashion, like in the 1980s, as well as high fashion. Thus began the practice of archiving vintage items, along with specific guidelines, namely by people within the fashion sector. In fact, specific types of vintage were developed: military vintage or ethnic, the collections of high fashion brands, or of illustratorial pieces from the 1950s, all things that would later be useful to contemporary industry for drawing inspiration, both for textile design and for actual clothing items. So now, vintage stores and warehouses are places that are almost always frequented by people working in the textile and clothing industry, who look here for particular objects or sources of inspiration that can be brought into contemporary collections. One particular aspect of this practice is carried out by textile designers who are also looking at the way that textiles are worn out. Wear is now part of our aesthetic, and we often buy pieces of clothing that have a kind of artistic degradation to them, that is, applications or processes that imitate the use gained by time. So the contemporary fashion industry looks to use textiles for inspiration, to insert elements of aging or wear into new products, which is often more appreciated than things that are perfectly new. I think there is a sentimental element behind the purchase of a vintage piece of clothing, an item that has its own history. The history of each vintage item is reborn each time a person wears it, so the fascinating element is the history that the item brings with it as it continues to be reborn and live in the present day.
An integral part of the exhibit is the photography contest called #MyVintage, the first instance of crowdsourced curation in Italy. The contest encourages visitors to explore their personal concept of vintage lifestyle through photos, which they then submit online. So what does vintage mean to you? Snap a picture and send it to the exhibit's website at vintage.museodeltessuto.it/submit and watch it grow as it gets more votes. If you think you've got something fashionable from years ago that is lurking in your closet, break it out and call it fashionable again. More so, wear it for a day out to Prato to see this fun exhibit. You've got until May 30th, 2013.